Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're diving into something super interesting. At least I think so. The kind of tricky relationship between our emotions and what makes us want to learn, especially in like a classroom setting.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it, right? Have you ever had that like aha moment? That spark of excitement when something finally clicks? Or the opposite, that feeling of just complete frustration when you're stuck on
Oh,
something?
yeah.
It's like these aren't just random feelings, are they? They're really shaping how we learn and why we even bother to try in the first place.
That's exactly it. And what's really cool is that this isn't just, something we've all noticed anecdotally.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole body of research in educational psychology
Mhm.
looking at this connection. And actually, you sent me this really fascinating review
I
article
did,
that
yeah.
really digs into how our understanding of this whole thing
Mm.
has evolved over time.
Yeah, it's pretty dense, but super insightful. I mean, if anyone out there listening has ever wondered what really gets students engaged or why sometimes it feels like their motivation just vanishes,
Uh-huh.
this is the deep dive for you. So, what we're going to do today is pull out the key takeaways from that research. We want to understand how our emotions actually impact our desire to learn, trace the evolution of this whole field, like how did researchers even get to these conclusions, and maybe even take a peek into the future of this research.
Yeah.
Like, where could this understanding lead us? So, consider this your crash course on the core dynamics at play, those forces that shape how we absorb new information. Okay, so to kick things off, where did this idea that our emotions and our motivation to learn are connected even come from?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, it wasn't always such a central focus in education, was it?
You know what's so interesting is that in the early research on motivation and instruction, emotions were almost treated as if they were irrelevant, like they weren't really part of the equation. But obviously, our perspective has really shifted since then. Now we see emotions as these things that are often shared within a classroom. They can generate new feelings, sort of bouncing off each other, and they definitely influence motivation. And it all happens within that specific learning environment.
So it's moved beyond just looking at the individual student to considering the whole classroom as this dynamic system.
Exactly, exactly. So it's not just about individual quirks anymore. It's about recognizing that these feelings are actually shaped by and contribute to the overall context of the classroom.
Yeah, I can totally see that. You walk into a classroom and you can just feel the emotional atmosphere, right?
You can.
It's palpable. So, I guess before we go any further, we should probably define what we mean by emotions in this context. What are we actually talking about here?
Right. Well, the research we've been discussing actually highlights a really useful definition from Ortney and Turner back in 1990. They argued that emotions are multifaceted. They involve things like how we appraise or interpret a situation, the urge or tendency to act in a certain way because of that appraisal, what we desire, the actual subjective feeling itself, and even our body's physiological responses.
Oh, wow.
So it's a lot more complex than just, a happy feeling or a sad feeling.
Yeah, it's more than just a simple feeling that pops up. It's like rooted in how we see things, and it can lead to specific actions.
Right, exactly. And then to build on that idea, Ford, in 1992, added that emotions are like signals. They give us information about what has happened, what's happening right now, and even what we anticipate might happen in a given situation. This really emphasizes how tightly our emotions are tied to the specific environment we're in this case, the learning environment.
It's like this internal feedback system almost that's constantly guiding how we engage with the material.
Yeah, I like that. And Ford actually viewed emotions as this powerful source of information that we can use to better understand and even influence our own motivational patterns. Like, for example, if you feel that knot of anxiety when you're faced with a certain type of math problem, that feeling could be signaling that maybe you need to try a different approach
Yeah.
or ask for help.
That's a good point. And the review article also mentions Pinterich and Chunk, who emphasize the importance of an emotional climate that's built on trust. So, why is that so crucial? Why trust specifically?
Well, if you think about it, a classroom where students feel safe and supported emotionally is going to be a much better environment for their motivation to flourish, right?
Absolutely.
It's that sense of trust between the students and the teacher that creates this foundation where they're more comfortable taking risks, even making mistakes, which are both essential parts of learning.
It makes a huge difference. I mean, imagine trying to learn a new skill and everyone's watching you and judging you
Oh, yeah.
versus learning with friends who are encouraging. Like the emotional difference is just massive.
Well, it's huge. And Lazarus's relational motivational cognitive theory from 1991 also supports this idea. Like, it's saying that emotions aren't just internal. They don't just come from inside us. They're actually a product of the constant back and forth between the individual and their environment, their surroundings. So in this case, it's that interaction between the student and the classroom.
It's this constant dance between the learner and the learning environment.
Exactly, yeah. And more recently, educational researchers like Bowler in 1999 and Zemblas in 2003 have really highlighted that emotions aren't these like isolated universal things. They're deeply intertwined with our actions, our relationships with other people in the learning space, and our overall lived experiences within that environment.
And the research you looked at supports this idea that positive support from the teacher, and that includes the positive emotions the teacher expresses, is consistently linked to students being more motivated, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a lot of research backing this up. Studies by, Patrick and Turner, among
Yeah.
others, have shown this over and over again.
Mm.
When teachers are enthusiastic about what they're teaching and they provide genuine support, it creates this positive emotional backdrop that really fuels students' desire to learn.
Yeah, it's almost contagious, but in a good way. It sounds tricky, though, like for researchers who are trying to study all of this. I mean, our emotions, our thoughts, and our motivations, they aren't really separate things, are they?
Not at all. In fact, researchers have found it incredibly difficult to tease those three things apart. Emotions, cognitions, our thoughts, and motivations, especially when they're observing classrooms or looking at what students say about their experiences. It's all just so intertwined.
Yeah.
And that very interconnectedness is a big reason why the field is constantly re-examining how these elements influence each other.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about some of these initial understandings of emotion and motivation. Now, I noticed that the research also makes a distinction between the words emotion and affect. To me, just in everyday language, they seem pretty similar. So, what's the nuance here that the researchers are pointing out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it raises a really important point about how we use these terms. While emotion and affect are sometimes used interchangeably in casual conversation, the research suggests a helpful distinction when we're trying to understand learning.
Okay.
Emotion tends to refer to those immediate, intense feelings that we have in response to a specific event or situation, like that sudden frustration when you hit a wall on a problem, or the excitement when you finally grasp a difficult concept.
Yeah.
Rosenberg, back in 1998, suggested that emotions are relatively short-lived, which kind of supports this idea.
So, it's like a specific reaction to a particular moment in the learning process.
Exactly, and those emotions can change pretty quickly, depending on what's happening. Frida, in 1988, added to this by saying that these are subjective experiences that are tied to the meaning we give a situation, and they often prepare us to act in a certain way. And Lazarus's perspective in 1991 also fits with this. He saw emotions as our personal appraisals of how a situation affects us, like, do we see it as a threat, a challenge, or a benefit? And those appraisals can then trigger both actions and even changes in our bodies.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so emotion is more of an in-the-moment response. So what then is affect in this learning context?
Right, good question. Affect in this context seems to be a broader term. It refers more to the overall patterns of emotional interaction within a learning environment over a longer period of time. So you could think of it as the general emotional tone or the effective classroom climate.
So if the effective climate is like the prevailing weather in the classroom,
Yeah.
the specific emotions are like individual rainstorms or sunny spells.
I like that. That's a really good analogy. And that overall climate, that effective climate, it really sets the stage for how students will interpret different situations, how they'll set their learning goals, choose their strategies, and ultimately how they'll take action. Our research has actually found that experiencing positive emotions can act as a kind of signal or marker that you're in a supportive interaction or a positive learning environment.
Like little indicators that things are on the right track.
Yeah, exactly. And when researchers analyze classroom discussions, they often look at whether the emotions being expressed seem to be helping or hindering learning. It's part of how they interpret what's happening. So,
Yeah.
for example, a teacher who uses a warm, encouraging tone
Mhm.
versus one who makes sarcastic or dismissive comments,
Right.
that's a big difference in terms of the affective impact.
Right. And it's the consistency of that emotional support from the teacher
Yeah,
that really helps to build that overall positive classroom climate.
exactly. It's not just random. Positive classroom environments are built up through these repeated experiences of positive emotions. We've even gone so far as to ask students directly about their general feelings of being supported and how much they're enjoying the class, and then compare those reports to our own analysis of the teacher's communication patterns. How supportive are they being? And often those two things line up, especially at the classroom level. So the instruction that students find motivating often goes hand in hand with a teacher who provides a lot of support, including positive emotional cues and expressions of care.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so let's bring back those theoretical frameworks we talked about earlier, academic risk-taking, flow theory, and goal theory. How did these frameworks help us understand the role of emotions in learning?
Well, initially, the main focus of these theories was really on understanding motivation itself, with a lot of emphasis on the interactions between teachers and students. But as research progressed, it became clear that we couldn't really grasp motivation in the classroom without acknowledging the powerful influence of both positive and negative emotions.
Yeah, it seems like they're two sides of the same coin. You can't really talk about one without the other.
Exactly. And, the research focus also evolved over time. It moved from primarily looking at individual student characteristics, like whether they were willing to take risks, to examining those broader patterns of instructional interaction that really promote engagement and involvement for a wider range of students.
Hmm.
What's so valuable about these three theoretical perspectives is that even though their main goal was to explain motivation, they provided these frameworks and research methods that allowed us to also gather data on students' emotions and how they perceive the emotional climate of their classrooms.
So, in a way, by studying motivation, they kind of accidentally opened this window into the emotional world of learning.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. But essentially, yes. By trying to understand why and how students approach challenges and what makes learning feel inherently rewarding, researchers kept running into the powerful influence of emotions.
Okay, so let's unpack these one by one, starting with academic risk-taking. How did that framework shed light on the emotional side of motivation for you?
Well, Clifford, in his work on academic risk-taking, he described risk-takers as students who actively sought out more challenging tasks. They saw failure as a natural part of learning, and they were very flexible in adapting their learning strategies when they hit a roadblock. And these students were generally more driven by a desire to really understand and master the material,
Uh-huh.
what we often call mastery focused, rather than just wanting to get a good grade or outperforming others.
So they weren't afraid to push themselves, to go outside their comfort zone and try something difficult?
Exactly. For them, the ideal scenario was to choose tasks that were just challenging enough to really push their understanding and give them meaningful feedback. They were generally more okay with uncertainty and making mistakes because they saw those as necessary steps on the path to deeper learning. And these students also tended to be more self-regulated, meaning they were really good at monitoring their own learning and adjusting their approach as needed.
They sound like they're really engaged and very resilient
Yeah.
as learners.
Yeah, for sure. And when researchers used Clifford's School Failure Tolerance Scale, or SFT, to study these students, some interesting emotional patterns emerged.
Mm.
For example, in one study that involved this kite building project, the students who were identified as academic risk takers, they consistently reported that they preferred more difficult tasks. They were more likely to take positive action after a setback.
Okay.
And really crucially, they experienced less negative emotion when they didn't succeed right away. So it's that difference in how they respond emotionally to failure, and that really seems to impact their motivation.
That lower negative feeling after failing, it seems super important, right? It's like they don't get as discouraged by setbacks.
It really does. And on the flip side, those students who were identified as risk avoiders, they tended to report more negative emotions after failing. And what's really interesting is how these survey responses actually lined up with what students said in interviews. For example, some of the risk-avoiding students would talk about feeling angry when their classmates did well, or express this strong need to feel respected even if their own work wasn't that great. One student even described taking math tests as this physically stressful experience, like it was as intense as playing a soccer game. So you really get a sense of how much anxiety they associated with the possibility of failure.
That's such a vivid illustration of how high the emotional stakes can feel for those students.
It is. And in contrast, those students who were identified as risk takers, they often expressed positive emotions when talking about math or challenging projects. They describe them as fun and genuinely enjoyed the process of working through those difficult problems and eventually succeeding. And this really suggests that those who are able to persevere through those challenges and see errors as opportunities to learn, they tend to be more engaged and they ultimately achieve more. And their positive feelings also seem to foster a sense of value and a more positive attitude towards subjects like math and just effortful work in general.
And for those risk avoiders, it sounds like those negative feelings had the opposite effect on their motivation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Experiencing all those negative emotions after failing, it often led those students to devalue the task, to want to avoid similar challenges in the future, and to develop this negative attitude towards putting in effort. The risk avoiders even showed this tendency to try to negotiate down the difficulty level of tasks.
Really?
Like they'd rather avoid those potential negative feelings than risk failing at something more challenging.
So they're prioritizing comfort over growth.
In a way, yeah. And this research on academic risk-taking really started to bring to light that emotional, the kind of hot side of motivation, which might have been overlooked in the earlier research that was more focused on cognitive factors.
Right. Okay, that was a really fascinating look at how our emotions and our reactions to challenge and failure tie into our academic risk-taking. So let's move on to flow theory. How did that framework help us understand emotion in learning?
So flow theory, developed by Csikszentmihalyi, it's especially useful because it integrates cognition, motivation, and emotion in its description of the student's experience during learning.
Okay.
The core idea is that when learning is optimal, it's intrinsically motivating, meaning it's rewarding in and of itself, and it's also linked with those positive emotions and enhanced cognitive processing.
It's like that feeling of being totally absorbed in what you're doing, where time just seems to disappear.
Yes, exactly. So when you're in a state of flow, you tend to report having very clear goals, a strong sense of making progress, a really focused attention that feels effortless, and time just seems to fly by. You might even lose track of your surroundings and yourself.
Uh-huh.
And crucially, there's this balance between the challenge of the activity and your perceived skills. You feel like you're being challenged, but not overwhelmed.
So that concept of optimal challenge that we saw in the risk-taking research, it connects here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually the initial connection point for our research using this framework.
Yeah.
But what we soon rediscovered was that emotions were also super important when we looked at students' experiences of both flow and non-flow in the classroom. So to study this, we adapted this method called experience sampling, where students would periodically report on what they were experiencing, including their emotions, using simple scales like happy, sad.
So you're getting these real-time glimpses into their emotional state.
Exactly. And we combined these student reports with really detailed classroom observations and analysis of what people were saying, the discourse.
Mm.
And by using this multifaceted approach, we could start to see these patterns in classrooms where students reported different levels of engagement.
Okay.
And what we found was that in classrooms we labeled as having high involvement, students reported being in a flow state much more frequently.
But not always, right? Like I remember that one interesting finding where you had a high involvement classroom,
Right.
but it didn't necessarily lead to high flow.
Exactly. And in that particular classroom, what we noticed was that while the teacher was presenting very challenging material and focusing on complex concepts, it actually seemed to exceed the students' current skill levels. So instead of flow, that challenge actually led to more anxiety.
Oh, I see.
And then on the other hand, in classrooms characterized by low involvement, we saw a lot more of those non-flow experiences like apathy and boredom. So the main takeaway here is that high engagement doesn't automatically equal a positive learning experience. That balance between challenge and skill is really important, and so are the emotions that result from that balance.
That makes a lot of sense. Too much challenge without the skills to meet it, that leads to stress and frustration.
Right.
But not enough challenge leads to boredom and disengagement.
Exactly. Exactly. And then there was this other really interesting finding, a nuanced one. In situations where students reported being bored, so their skills were higher than the challenge, they would sometimes report feeling happy but not proud.
Happy but not proud. That's a really interesting distinction. What do you think that tells us?
It suggests that simply being engaged, or even feeling a mild positive emotion, it doesn't necessarily mean that the learning is deep or meaningful. Like academic emotions are more complex than just feeling good or bad. In that specific context, the low level of challenge seemed to explain why they were feeling happy. Maybe it was just the ease of the task. But the fact that they weren't feeling proud suggests that they weren't really experiencing a sense of accomplishment or growth. And this really underscored for us the importance of getting a lot more detailed information about the classroom context, the specific types of interactions, the content being learned, how long the activities lasted, the intensity, the level of challenge, and the precise emotions being experienced to really understand what's going on and why.
Okay, that's fascinating how flow theory really emphasizes the need for that balance and the importance of specific types of positive emotions
Yeah.
if we want learning to be optimal. So now let's look at goal theory. How did that framework bring emotion into our understanding of student motivation?
So goal theory, with people like Ames and Dweck, initially it focused on how the goal structures that are present in classrooms, what the teachers emphasize, and also the specific teaching methods they used, how all of that impacted students' own reports of their motivation.
Okay.
It helped to explain things like why students might choose to take or avoid risks in their learning and what makes them more involved.
Uh-huh.
Early on, the way goal theory looked at emotion was pretty straightforward, almost too simple. Basically, the idea was if you achieve your goal, you feel good. If you fail, you feel
Like a
bad.
very linear cause and effect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then in 1992, Ford's motivational systems theory, or MST, started to change that view. He proposed that emotion, agency, that's your sense of control, and goals are actually all central, and they interact with each other in a much more dynamic way.
Okay.
And he argued that our emotions actually provide clues about the goals we're pursuing and how well we're doing at reaching them. And more recent work within goal theory has really taken this idea and run with it, exploring why students adopt certain achievement goals in the first place.
So instead of emotions just being a reaction at the end, they're actually part of the process of setting goals and figuring out how to pursue them.
Exactly. So our first big study that really used goal orientation theory looked at the connection between Clifford's scale for academic risk-taking and this other measure that assesses students' mastery and performance goals, their sense of self-efficacy, or their belief in their ability to succeed, and the different learning strategies they use. What we found was that emotion acts as a mediator between students' overall achievement goals and their beliefs and self-regulatory behaviors.
So almost like a go-between that influences how the goal translates into action.
Right, exactly. And for example, we found that those negative feelings about failing or making mistakes, those help to explain why students who are really driven by performance goals, the ones who are focused on looking good and outperforming everyone else, those students often adopt behaviors that are more about protecting their ego, avoiding looking bad, than actually focusing on learning and improving.
So it's more about appearances than understanding.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas students who are more motivated by mastery goals, that desire to learn and grow, they either didn't interpret making mistakes in a negative way, or they were just better at managing any negative feelings that did come up. So those emotions didn't really get in the way of their learning.
Interesting.
We even found that the negative feelings students reported after experiencing failure, those actually acted as a mediator between having those strong performance goals and engaging in self-regulated learning. And what was interesting is that we didn't see that same direct link between having mastery goals and reporting negative affect, which suggests that students who are more mastery-oriented are often better at regulating their emotions when they're faced with challenges.
Like they have some kind of internal toolkit for dealing with setbacks.
Exactly, exactly. And this actually lines up with other research, like the work by Kuhl and Kruska, on the importance of being able to manage emotions and how the fear of failure can really hold students back. Goal theory has also been really helpful in exploring how the specific interactions that happen in the classroom can actually regulate students' emotions, their thinking, and their motivation. And through this research, we started to see these clear connections between the overall classroom climate and the types of goal structures that were emphasized by the teacher.
So is it fair to say that a classroom where the teacher emphasizes learning and understanding tends to have a more supportive emotional environment?
That seems to be the case, based on our research and the work of others. Students' perceptions of classrooms that emphasize mastery goals, where the focus is on learning for the sake of learning, putting in effort, and really understanding the material, those were consistently linked to their perceptions of the teacher as being supportive. And this really highlights that supportive teaching has this emotional component that's super important. The mastery goal structures and the teacher support, those two things seem to be really tightly intertwined in the students' reports and in our analyses of the classroom discussions. It's like positive emotions as reflected in that high level of perceived teacher support and that classroom emphasis on mastery. Those are really key ingredients in creating what feels like a mastery-oriented classroom to the students.
I see.
Yeah.
And I remember you did a follow-up study where you looked at classrooms with different emotional climates. What did that reveal about this connection?
Yeah, in that study, we wanted to distinguish between classrooms that were perceived as consistently positive and supportive, those that were consistently negative and unsupportive, and then those that were kind of ambiguous, where the signals were mixed.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things we found, which was surprising, was that students in both the ambiguous and the consistently negative classrooms, they showed similar levels of avoidance, disruptive behavior, and even cheating, which was interesting. It really underscores how important it is to create and maintain that consistently positive emotional climate in the classroom.
Wow.
And what was also really striking was that these patterns of teacher support, whether they were consistently positive or negative, they were often there from the very beginning of the school year. It's like those underlying psychological environments are established really early on, and they tend to stay pretty stable.
So the emotional tone that the teacher sets at the beginning can have this lasting effect on the whole year.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of our findings really support this broader body of research that says that teachers' emotional support is so crucial for students' academic and social well-being. It's things like how enthusiastic the teacher is about the subject, whether they use humor in a positive way, and just their overall passion for learning. It all matters.
Yeah.
And it all points to this dynamic interplay between what the students are experiencing and what the teachers are experiencing, where understandings, perceptions, and actions are constantly being co-created and co-regulated through their interactions day after day.
Right. So to sort of wrap things up here and think about the future, how can we take this deeper understanding of the relationship between emotion, cognition, and motivation and really move the field forward? What are some of the directions that future research could take?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the ongoing challenges with a lot of our current theories is that they tend to put these three processes, emotion, cognition, and motivation, they put them in this kind of hierarchical or chronological relationship,
Okay.
where one is seen as the primary driver, or it influences the others in this linear step-by-step way. For example, some researchers have said that emotion is this sort of overarching concept, while others see emotions as being more embedded within motivational patterns.
Mm.
And even our own early work, we have to admit, sometimes we fell into this trap of focusing more on motivation than on emotion.
Well, it's a complicated web, right? It's hard to untangle those threads.
It really is.
Huh.
But our current understanding is that motivation and emotion are probably much more intertwined. They happen simultaneously more often than not. And a big goal for future research is to find better ways to measure learning as it's happening in the classroom.
Yeah.
To really try to understand how these motivational and emotional states interact during that active process of learning, while also taking into account the impact of the specific classroom context.
Yeah.
And we also need to keep refining our understanding of which emotions are most relevant and influential in academic settings, which ones really matter.
So it's about moving beyond those simpler, more linear models. What are some of the ways we could do that, theoretically?
One promising direction is to go back and really test those theories that already try to integrate these processes, like attribution theory
Mm-hmm.
or slow theory, to see how well they explain what we're seeing in classrooms.
Okay.
Another approach is to adapt our existing theories to try to better incorporate this dynamic interplay of emotion and motivation.
Mm.
Like that bidirectional model that links achievement goals and effect is a good example of this.
Right.
And our own research findings, which suggest that classrooms that have a lot of positive emotions, strong teacher support, and a collaborative atmosphere, those tend to be perceived by students as being more mastery-oriented. And that also suggests a need for more integrated theories. We're seeing more and more evidence that effective instruction often involves responding to and even shaping students' emotions. You could call it creating emotionally scaffolded goal structures.
So the teacher isn't just presenting information, they're also actively shaping the emotional landscape of the classroom in a way that supports those learning goals.
Precisely. And ultimately, we probably need to develop completely new models that can better explain the ways in which emotion, motivation, and learning, how they all evolve together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. And one way to do that might be to focus on those patterns of interaction between teachers and students over time.
Uh-huh.
And, there's also this growing awareness of how important those initial interactions are in the first few days of school for establishing the overall psychological environment of the classroom. And then those daily interactions, those reinforce both the explicit and the implicit rules of the classroom. So the big picture idea is that emotion, cognition, and motivation are all part of this complex system of co-regulation between the teacher and the students.
Okay.
And if we want to create and sustain those truly engaging classroom climates, it requires a continuous effort to nurture those positive interactions.
Yeah.
We can't think of these things as separate entities. They're an integrated whole that emerges from those ongoing interactions within a supportive emotional context.
That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like we also need to be thinking differently about how we actually study all of this. Are there limitations to our current research methods?
For sure, yeah. If we really want to test these more integrated theories and develop a deeper understanding, we need research methods that can capture that complexity. And while our traditional methods, things like surveys and classroom observations, those have given us a lot of good information, they also have limitations.
Hmm.
We need to be using more rigorous, multi-method, and multi-level research designs, ones that can actually track these intricate interactions over time and across different levels, from the individual student all the way up to the whole classroom.
Right.
And it's a big challenge. It means both finding more sophisticated ways to use the tools we already have and developing new ones that can really capture the nuances of what makes a learning environment positive and what makes teaching truly effective.
So what does this multi-method, multi-level approach actually look like in practice? What would researchers actually do?
Well, it means being really intentional about combining different types of data to get a fuller picture. For example, we might use really detailed surveys to understand students' motivations and emotions, but we'd also do systematic classroom observations to record the interactions between the teachers and the students to capture the overall emotional atmosphere. And then we might also analyze the actual language that's used in the classroom, both what's being said and how it's being said. And when we say multi-level, it means looking at the data from different perspectives.
Hmm.
So we're thinking about the individual student's experience, but within the context of their particular classroom, and then comparing that across different classrooms.
Okay.
We also need to use more sophisticated statistical models, ones that can account for those different levels of data and how all the variables we're studying are connected. So as an example, we might ask students about how they're feeling during different activities, while we're also observing how the teacher responds to students who are struggling or showing signs of frustration.
So you get a much richer understanding than you would with just one method.
Exactly. Yeah. Early on in this research, there was this assumption that students could accurately recall and easily label their emotions, but we've learned that that's not always true.
Right.
So we need to be really careful about how we use our research methods, make sure they're appropriate for each context. We've also found that when we're analyzing classroom discussions, it's much more accurate to use multiple codes at the same time to capture the different layers of communication, both cognitive and emotional. And we also need better ways to capture those nonverbal cues, things like tone of voice, emphasis, the pace of speech, and body language.
It's like if you tried to understand a conversation by only reading the transcript,
Mm.
you'd miss all the emotional undertones.
That's such a good analogy.
Yeah.
And to really push the boundaries of what we know, we also need to explore those more innovative methods, maybe even borrow some that have worked well in other fields. Like, we need to move beyond relying so much on those traditional group surveys, which can sometimes give us a pretty limited view of the student's experience, and they only capture how they felt in the past, not in the moment.
So what kind of methods are you thinking of?
Well, there are physiological measures like tracking changes in skin conductance, which can tell us about emotional arousal, or using special